Welcome to Extraordinary Catholics, a podcast for, you guessed it, extraordinary Catholics.
In a world with over 1 billion ordinary Catholics, the Good Samaritans of Vatican-free Catholicism are truly extraordinary, seeking to model Jesus' inclusive spirit and his discipleship of equals. Like Roman Catholicism, inclusive Catholicism possesses valid lines of apostolic succession and shares valid sacraments.
1 in every 10 adult Americans self-identifies as a former Roman Catholic. If we were to band together, we would form the second largest religion in America. In Mexico, over 1,000 Roman Catholics leave the church every single day.
To learn more about inclusive Catholicism, please visit www.extraordinarycatholics.faith and join our Extraordinary Catholics Facebook group.
And now, meet the host of Extraordinary Catholics, the pastor of Holy Family Catholic Church, the only inclusive Catholic community in Austin, Texas, Father Jamie Matthias.
Welcome, Extraordinary Catholics. I am Father Jamie Matthias, pastor of Holy Family Catholic Church in Austin, Texas. We thank the special saints who helped make this episode possible. Corey Hurt Montiel of Holy Family Catholic Church in Austin, Texas. Bishop Jerry Brohl of the Independent Roman Catholic Church in Wyandotte, Michigan. Bishop Theodore Feldman of the Sanctuary Divine Providence in Birmingham, Alabama. Reverend Canon Michelangelo D'Arrigo of Agape Fellowship of Atlanta, Georgia, part of the Convergent Christian Communion. Bobby Duhan and Heather Lucas of Holy Family Catholic Church in Austin, Texas. Looking to earn your wings? Visit dwy.io/podcast to join the list of saints who are stepping up to sponsor future episodes. Can I ask you a favor? Will you prayerfully consider sharing a quick rating and/or review of this podcast? You are a saint. And now let's continue our exploration of the theological foundations of inclusive Catholicism. Wow, we've spent quite a bit of time exploring the book of Genesis and seeing what we as extraordinary Catholics might learn from this first book of the Hebrew Scriptures. And now we come to the longest and most detailed story of the book of Genesis, a story that Father Lawrence Boat, the author of Reading the Old Testament, refers to as, quote, a novella, a short romantic novel. It delights in aspects completely ignored by the sagas, details about foreign customs, psychological insights, dramatic encounters, and descriptions of Joseph's character, prudent, modest, gifted in dream analysis, well-spoken, and bred to nobility. In short, the perfect wise man of the ancient world. End quote. The book of Genesis finishes with the story of Jacob's 12 sons, a clear sign of the androcentric patriarchal society in which the work was written. The story focuses on Jacob's son Yōsef, whose name was Romanized as Yōsef. In Spanish, we know him as José. In English, we know him as Joseph. Moses would later lead the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, so the story of Yōsef became the etiological explanation for how we ended up in Egypt. And what is fascinating about this story is that God never speaks to Yōsef in the same way that God spoke to Yōsef's ancestors, Avraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Never. In his work, God, a Biography, Jack Miles writes, quote, Jacob asked of the God of Abraham and Isaac, when this God first appeared to him at Luz, renamed Bethel, food, shelter, and safe conduct back from Padan Aram to Canaan. What Joseph receives from the same God, he never asks for it, is a successful career in the Egyptian bureaucracy. To Jacob, God speaks directly or in a dream or vision so unequivocal that it requires no interpretation. God never speaks thus to Joseph. The Spirit of God that Pharaoh, not Joseph himself, says is in Joseph is a talent, a gift of God, but not one that requires communication with God for its functioning. End quote. In Genesis 37, we find the story of Yōsef, a 17-year-old shepherd who tended the flocks with his half-brothers, the sons of Jacob's wife Leah, and Jacob's concubines Bilhah and Zilpah. Genesis 37, 1-2. His relationship with them was strained. Joseph was a tattletale. Genesis 37, 2. Quote, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, end quote. Genesis 37, 3. And Jacob gave Yōsef that famous and amazing Technicolor dream coat, Genesis 37, 3. Yōsef's brothers, quote, hated him and could not speak a kind word to him, end quote, Genesis 37, 4, which sets up the story of how he got to Egypt. Yōsef's dream of the vacas flacas, of the skinny cows, Genesis 37, 6-7, which continues to influence the Latino mentality of saving up for lean times, only inflamed the jealousy of Yōsef's brothers, Genesis 37, 11, since his dream suggested that Yōsef was more important than his brothers, and they, quote, hated him all the more, end quote. Genesis 37, 5. Yōsef's brothers stripped him of his amazing Technicolor dream coat, sold him to an Egypt-bound caravan of Ishmaelites, the descendants of Avram and his concubine Hagar, and covered up their misdeed, Genesis 37, 18-33. And now, extraordinary Catholics, the story shifts from Yōsef and gets really good. The author of Genesis diverts our attention to Jacob's daughter-in-law, Tamar, who is so important in salvation history that she is listed in the genealogy of her descendant, Yeshua bar Yosef, Jesus of Nazareth, Matthew 1:3. In fact, Tamar is one of only 4 women listed in Jesus' genealogy, as if all those guys could have given birth without women. And what is significant is the irregular situation of each of the 4 women, which prepares us for Mary's very irregular situation, since she is purportedly impregnated by the Holy Spirit. Luke 1:35. Before we get to Tamar's story, a bit of geography. King David's united kingdom would later be comprised of Israel in the north, named after Jacob, and Judah in the south, named after Judah, the 4th of 6 sons born by Jacob and Leah. The capital of Judah was Jerusalem, David's capital city. So, of course, of all of Jacob's son, we're going to trace Jesus back to the tribe for whom the most important part of David's kingdom was named, right? Why trace Jesus back to the tribes of Asher or Naphtali in the way north of Israel, or to Zebulun, which lies between the two and which is where Nazareth is located? Why do that when you can just as easily trace Jesus back to the tribe in which the capital, Jerusalem, is located? The tribe, incidentally, from which Micah said the Messiah would one day come. Micah 5:2. Forget Nazareth. As the son of David, Jesus had to descend from Judah, and as Messiah, Jesus had to come from Bethlehem. We remember that the patriarchs and their children were more likely composite figures, helping us to understand where we came from and our relationship to neighboring people, rather than as historical people who lived more than 1,000 years before the stories about them were written in the 6th century BC. According to the saga, Judah married a nameless Canaanite woman who bore him 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah, Genesis 38, 2-5. A nameless woman? 3 sons? Signs of a tale told by an androcentric patriarchal society. Judah secured Tamar as the wife of his firstborn, who was, quote, wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death, end quote, Genesis 38, 6. Tamar now had the status of a Yevemah, a widow obligated to marry her deceased husband's brother in order to raise up seed for her deceased husband. Any child born to a Yevamah and her Yavam, her brother-in-law, would be considered the child of the deceased man for the purposes of name and inheritance. In his work, The Mothers, French social anthropologist Robert Briffaut noted that this pagan practice, now found among the Israelites, was a vestige of fraternal polyandry, a form of male sexual prerogative where tribal brotherhood gave a man the right to his brother's widow. Sheesh. As Judith Antonelli writes, quote, "A woman was acquired in marriage not for an individual man, but for an entire household. The eldest brother in the household contracted marriage. His wives were then shared by his younger brothers, and sometimes by his father and uncles as well." End quote. Interestingly, Antonelli suggests that this phratriarchy, this rule of tribal brotherhood, preceded patriarchy, the rule of fathers over their households, since, quote, "biological paternity was uncertain and often irrelevant. Children either were considered the offspring of the eldest brother, were assigned fathers in rotation, or had their paternity decided by their mother." End quote. The sharing of wives opened the door to the hospitality prostitution that we find in the Bible. Genesis 19 and Judges 19. The custom of waiving female chastity in order to provide sexual hospitality by offering your wives, concubines, or daughters for the satisfaction of male guests. Let's come back to that. The story gets better since Onan, the Yavam, who didn't want a child, practiced coitus interruptus. Quote, "Then Judah said to Onan, his second-born son, 'Sleep with your brother's wife, Tamar, and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to raise up offspring for your brother.' But Onan knew that the child would not be his, so whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from providing offspring for his brother. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death also." End quote. Genesis 38, 8-10. Yikes. Let's talk about biblical taboos. Interestingly, there is no specific condemnation of masturbation in the Bible, but this story was used as a proof text for the rabbinic prohibition against the spilling of seed, the pre-scientific way of explaining that the child was in the sperm in the same way that the plant was in any given seed. Any person or object that touched this seed was made unclean until evening. Leviticus 15, 16-18. Similar to the way in which any person who touched a menstruating woman or anything she touched was unclean until evening. Leviticus 15, 19-23. Note, these are issues of ceremonial cleanliness and not of morality. Aren't you glad that we live on this side of the Enlightenment? So Judah told Tamar to wait until his third son, Shelah, was old enough to marry her. Genesis 38:11. Presumably he was not yet 12 years old. Fast forward, Shelah was now old enough to marry Tamar, but Judah didn't want to give his son to a Katlanit like Tamar, to a woman who seemingly caused two husbands to die. Poor Tamar. She was now forbidden by Ibum, by levirate marriage, to marry outside her deceased husband's family. Thinking that the father-in-law had tricked her, she plotted Ibum, levirate marriage, with her father-in-law. One day, Judah traveled to Timnah for the sheep-shearing festival. When Tamar heard about this, quote, "She took off her widow's clothes, clothed herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance to Anaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that, though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, "Come now, let me sleep with you." "And what will you give me to sleep with you?" she asked. "I'll send you a young goat from my flock," he said. "Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it?" she asked. He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" "Your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand," she answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. End quote. Genesis 38:14-19. OMG. Tamar disguised herself as a kedeshah, a shrine prostitute. Her father-in-law committed idolatry by having intercourse with her. Then she disappeared with his seal, cord, and staff. He sent a friend to search for her, asking, "Where is the shrine prostitute who was beside the road at Enaim?" "There hasn't been any shrine prostitute there," they said. Genesis 38:21. 3 months later, Tamar shows up and, you guessed it, she's pregnant with Judah's child. We know that she's pregnant with her father-in-law's child, but he doesn't know it. So he's enraged to see that the woman who is technically married to his son Shelah is pregnant. He orders her execution, saying, "Bring her out and have her burned to death." Genesis 38:24. As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. "I am pregnant by the man who owns these," she said. And she used his words against him. Judah had previously presented Yōsef's amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat to his father Yaakov, saying, "Identify this, please." Genesis 37:32. Now Tamar shows him his own seal, cord, and staff, and says, "Identify this, please." Genesis 38:25. Uh-oh. And Judah recognized, quote, "She is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah." Genesis 38:26. Not only did Tamar avoid death, she gave birth to twins, an ancient birthing story worth reading, Genesis 38:27-30. And one of her twins was later reported to be an ancestor of King David, and hence an ancestor of the Messiah, Yeshua bar Yōsef. How fascinating that, even in the context of centuries of misogyny, of hatred toward women, nothing but praise has been heaped on Tamar for her wisdom and her tact for not publicly shaming Judah. What a great story, and Judah's giving in to temptation and having sex with a prostitute set the stage for his stepbrother Yōsef's refusal to have sex with his master's wife. We said we would return to the idea of hospitality prostitution. With hospitality prostitution, men waived the female chastity of their wives, concubines, and daughters in order to provide sexual hospitality for the satisfaction of male guests. Antonelli points out that the 3 male guests who visited Avram and who asked where his wife was, Genesis 18:9, received the response, "She's inside the tent," an indication that she was not included in his act of hospitality that day. In his work, Sex and Family in the Bible and in the Middle East, Raphael Patai notes that there was a mutual expectation. The wife or concubine or daughter had to satisfy the guest, and the guest had to satisfy her. If he failed to satisfy her, she tore his garments, and he was shamed and chased away. Recall the shame of torn garments, which was enacted when repentant people poured ashes on their heads and tore their garments. After the story of Tamar, we immediately pick up in Genesis with the story of Yōsef, now in Egypt, whose resistance to a sexual encounter will be contrasted with his brother Judah's giving in to temptation and having intercourse with his daughter-in-law. Yōsef found himself in Egypt, where he was sold by the Ishmaelites to the captain of the guard, Genesis 39:1. His master, Potiphar, put him in charge of his household, Genesis 39:3-6. Antonelli shares the suggestion from the Genesis Rabbah that Potiphar was a eunuch, since, quote, any man who was a harem guard and worked in the women's quarters of the palace was castrated to prevent his sexual involvement with the women, end quote. Married to a eunuch, Potiphar's wife tried to lure to bed the well-built and handsome Yōsef, Genesis 39:6, a phrase, says Antonelli, that, quote, indicates sexual objectification. A person's looks are all that matter in that moment, end quote. Antonelli continues, quote, Joseph had a lot of sex appeal to men as well as to women, end quote. I personally like Philo's telling of this story in his work on Joseph. Philo writes, Potiphar's wife was driven mad by the youth's handsomeness. Antonelli cites the Genesis Rabbah, which states that Yōsef was, quote, like a man who stood in the marketplace, making up his eyes, curling his hair, and lifting his heel, end quote. In her book, Rabbinic Body Language, Nonverbal Communication in Palestinian Rabbinic Literature of Late Antiquity, Catherine Hezer goes to town on that line, noting how the seemingly vain Yōsef's 3 effeminate behaviors, despised by men, were tolerated for this 17-year-old. At the time that the Genesis Rabbah was written, it was not uncommon for some men in the Roman Empire to curl their hair or use eye makeup. She writes, quote, the gesture of raising or swinging one's heel also needs to be understood as part of the vain man's dandy-like deportment. It is reminiscent of dancers and actors, athletes, gods, and emperors alike. In the context of Midrash, Joseph's effeminate behavior seems to have been tolerated by rabbis, end quote. The same Genesis Rabbah continues this effeminate image of Yōsef, suggesting that when his brothers arrived in Egypt, they imagined that they would find him working as a male prostitute. Quote, our brother Yōsef is well-built and handsome. Maybe he is working as a prostitute in a brothel, end quote. The Sotah and Genesis Rabbah contain X-rated stories of the interaction between Yōsef and Potiphar's wife, stories that I would blush to share here. Yōsef refused to go to bed with Potiphar's wife or even be with her. Genesis 39:10. The story continues, quote, she caught him by his cloak and said, come to bed with me. But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house, end quote. Genesis 39:12. Potiphar's wife screamed and blamed Yōsef, suggesting that he had made an advance on her. Genesis 39:13-16. Burning with rage, Potiphar imprisoned Yōsef, where Yōsef showed prophetic ability to interpret the dreams of 2 sexual minorities, 2 eunuchs who served as Pharaoh's baker and chief butler. Jack Miles notes that what Yōsef would soon, quote, directly accomplish is the rescue of an entire social order in which he is an outsider, end quote. In an article in the European Electronic Journal for Feminist Exegesis, Talia Gur-Klein picks up on this theme of Yōsef as an outsider, noting the parallelism of this story to the sex hospitality and hospitality prostitution we spoke of earlier. Quote, Potiphar, the insider, offers lavishly privileges and supervision to Joseph, while Joseph, the outsider, brings divine blessing on Potiphar's house. Relaxing her chastity, the host's wife exposes the structure, if we consider sexual hospitality in the story's pretext. Potiphar opens his entire house and its supervision to the outsider's pleasure, while his wife offers him her sexuality. Sexuality and hospitality intersect. End quote. Gour-Klein notes the similar elements to sexual hospitality or hospitality prostitution: the failure to satisfy the woman, the tearing of the man's clothing, and public shaming. We know that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are Abrahamic faiths, all tracing back to the same ancestor, Abraham. The Quran, the holy book of Islam, and the Sefer HaYashar, a medieval Jewish text, contain a subsequent story that Potiphar's wife, who was mocked by gossiping noble women for being infatuated with a Hebrew slave boy, then invited the handsome young Yōsef to a party of women who were distracted by his beauty. That 7th century story goes like this, quote, "Some women of the city gossiped. The chief minister's wife is trying to seduce her slave boy. Love for him has plagued her heart. Indeed, we see that she is clearly mistaken." When she heard about their gossip, she invited them and set a banquet for them. She gave each one a knife, then said to Joseph, "Come out before them." When they saw him, they were so stunned by his beauty that they cut their hands and exclaimed, "Good God, this cannot be human. This must be a noble angel." She said, "This is the one for whose love you criticized me. I did try to seduce him, but he firmly refused. And if he does not do what I order him to, he will certainly be imprisoned and fully disgraced." Joseph prayed, "My Lord, I would rather be in jail than do what they invite me to do. And if you do not turn their cunning away from me, I might yield to them and fall into ignorance." End quote. Surah 12, 30-33. Whereas the Sefer HaYashar imagined Potiphar's wife tearing the front of his cloak, the Quran imagined that, quote, "she tore his shirt from the back," end quote, as he tried to run away from her. Surah 12:25. Both texts gave her a name, Zelikhah. Some contemporary scholars, like Mir Sternberg, speak of the sexual abuse perpetrated against Yōsef by Zelikhah, who abuses her position of power, tries to coerce Yōsef into sex, and punishes him for his refusal by accusing him of attempted rape. Antonelli concludes, quote, "Potiphar knew that Joseph was innocent. Had Potiphar really believed Joseph was guilty, he would have had him executed. A servant, even a valued one, does not sleep with his master's wife and get away with it. Had anything really happened, a rape charge would have saved Zelikhah, but not Joseph, from the death penalty for adultery." End quote. Interestingly, the 15th century Persian Islamic work, Yōsef and Zelikhah, brought together various tellings of this epic love story, likening Zelikhah's longing for Yōsef to the soul's longing for God. The Book of Jubilees draws together loose threads, stating that Zelikhah later became Yōsef's mother-in-law when he married Asnat, Genesis 41:45, the daughter of Shechem and Dinah, recall the last episode, who was raised by Potipharah, understood by the author of the Book of Jubilees to be Potiphar, and by Zelikhah in Egypt. Interestingly, as a reward for interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, Yōsef was given a new name, Safnat, and a wife, Asnat, Genesis 41:45. Both Egyptian names end with nat, showing that they received their names from the Egyptian goddess Nut, the goddess of death and rebirth, who was believed to be speaking through Yōsef, an intriguing example of syncretism. and whose son, Osiris, was the Egyptian Christ figure, a god of death and resurrection, who, in the words of James Fraser, quote, fed his people with his broken body in this life, and who held out to them the promise of blissful eternity, end quote. Antonelli points out that Osiris introduced in Egypt the cultivation of the grain, wheat and barley, discovered by his sister, Isis. Osiris was depicted as a cornstalk, and Isis, the green goddess, as a field of corn. Osiris was also depicted as a bull, and Isis as a cow. Grain, cows, symbols in Pharaoh's dream interpreted by Yōsef, Genesis 41, 1-7, and 17-32. Yōsef was put in charge of Pharaoh's grain supply. The name of his wife, Asnat, means storehouse or granary. And so we see the Jewish heroes Yōsef and Asnat eclipsing the Egyptian gods Osiris and Isis, and foreshadowing another Yōsef and his wife who would raise the God of resurrection to whom early Judeo-Christians looked as their Messiah. Let's pause and reflect on the role of God in all this. Jack Miles writes, quote, "The Lord announces no intentions for Joseph and his offspring as God did for Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and theirs, and, for that matter, God has no intentions for Egypt either. In deciphering Pharaoh's dream and so foreseeing a coming famine, Joseph does not infer any divine plan for Egypt that he then implements. The famine is not divinely sent. God has simply helped Joseph to foresee it. The famine preparation plan, too, is Joseph's, not God's. In short, modest, timely, indirect assistance to Joseph essentially exhausts the divine repertory. The story of Joseph and his brothers is a moving and accessible one for modern readers because of this modern absence from it of a powerful, intrusive God. In the Joseph story, as in modern post-religious society, God is remote. But God's remoteness matters little, for God is thought of only fleetingly. In crisis moments, when God's help is sought to escape from some dilemma or avert some catastrophe. Modernity, expecting no surprises from God, speaks of God calmly, as Joseph does, and assumes that whatever God's power, God's intentions are benevolent. God is kind, as Joseph is kind. From this story of Yōsef, we infer how God is. Jack Miles continues, quote, "But if God is implicitly like Joseph in the closing chapters of Genesis, we can only note that God was not like Joseph in the opening chapters. The Lord, who did not forgive Adam and Eve for their single act of disobedience, was not like that forgiving Joseph. Neither was the Lord God like Joseph when God sent a flood that destroyed all flesh in retribution for scarcely named offenses in Noah's generation. The Lord God in those scenes is maximally powerful and minimally kind, whereas the God mirrored in Joseph is maximally kind and minimally powerful. The Lord, the less lawful, more willful, and more personal form of the deity, is absent from the last quarter of the book of Genesis." End quote. And with the story of Yōsef, we come to the end of the book of Genesis, a book that sheds great light on the ancient world and allows extraordinary Catholics to see so many vestiges of patriarchy, androcentrism, and marginalization that lingers to this day, influencing the way that people think and see the world, their God, and themselves today. As I so often say here at Holy Family, Catholics are not famous for knowing the Bible. When we do read the Bible, though, we find a tremendous story here of love and forgiveness, and a belief that God is, quote, writing straight with crooked lines, end quote, as Father Angelus Lafleur was fond of saying. God took care of Yōsef, and despite what they did to him, Yōsef forgave his brothers. He brought them and his father to Egypt to live in peace and prosperity. He reunited his family, and he credited God. He tells his brothers, quote, "It was not you who sent me here, but God." End quote. Genesis 45:8. Later he reaffirms, quote, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." End quote. Genesis 50:20. Ordinary Catholics might tear down others and betray them. Ordinary Catholics might say and do things that divide families and harbor ill will for those unable to forgive, like Yōsef. But we can't end there. Notice that Yōsef's God chose Yōsef for a reason, and Yōsef's God chose Yōsef over his older brother Judah and over his 10 older brothers. Why is this significant? Jack Miles writes, quote, "Social custom, repeatedly acknowledged in the text, dictated that the eldest son would be the father's heir. When God chooses against this custom, God expresses God's love to the admittedly limited extent that God is choosing someone and rejecting someone else. The text subtly suggests that God would not have liked Joseph if he were not like Joseph. And since Joseph has been shown to be loving, so perhaps is God. God does prefer Joseph, the text suggests, because, and here is the novelty, Joseph is the better person. In character and achievement, he is superior." End quote. As extraordinary Catholics, we have to be the better people, superior in character. We now recognize that most elements of this story of Yōsef were written by the tribes of Yōsef, of Ephraim and Manasseh, in the north, in Israel. And the injection into the Yōsef story of the incestual relationship of Judah and Tamar is there for a reason. As you hear these words of Jack Miles, think of inclusive Catholicism as Yōsef, and of the much older and larger Roman Catholic Church as Judah. Miles writes, quote, "The polemical point of the story is not just that the Jews are the offspring of an incestuous union, not even that they are the offspring of an incestuous Israelite-Canaanite union, but that they are the offspring of an incestuous union between an Israelite man and a Canaanite woman in the act of Canaanite cultic copulation. By Genesis 38, intermarriage with the Canaanites has twice been condemned." End quote. At the end of Genesis, Jacob's blessing didn't go to Judah's sons by Tamar. Their sons Perez and Zerah are ignored. Jacob's blessings went to Yōsef's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. This blessing by Jacob and by Jacob's God didn't go to the elder son from whom the Messiah descended. It went to the tribes who told their story. As inclusive Catholics, we need to do a better job of telling our story and of the way in which we are truly living Jesus' good news of love, mercy, forgiveness, and peace, of the way in which we, like Yōsef, are worthy of God's blessing. So often in inclusive Catholicism, we find ourselves reflecting on the various incestuous relationships that have deprived the Roman Church of Jacob's blessing, beginning with its alliance with the Roman Empire and its choosing of money, power, and influence over a wholehearted embrace of Jesus' gospel message and his discipleship of equals. That's the vision we need to hold up and live in our lives and ministry. Let's be the Yōsefs of this world, loving and forgiving others, even those who have done us wrong. Let's be the Yōsefs of this world, bringing others together and reflecting to them God's mercy and peace. Let's be the Yōsefs of this world, which is what it really means to be extraordinary Catholics.
Thank you for joining us for Extraordinary Catholics podcast with Father Jamie Mathias.
Check out our directory of over 2,000 inclusive Catholic clergy at www.extraordinarycatholics.faith.
Have an extraordinary day.